Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. It was a cold, rainy evening, and the city streets were slick with the remnants of a storm that had been raging for hours. Most people had retreated indoors, seeking warmth and comfort, leaving the streets eerily quiet. The dim glow of street lamps flickered through the mist, casting long shadows on the pavement. Among the sparse crowd that braved the rain, a man in a sleek black suit hurried along, his mind preoccupied with the stresses of his high-powered life. He was the kind of man who seemed to have it all: wealth, status, and a life that many envied. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that he was late. Richard Hale, the millionaire CEO of a tech empire, was desperate. His phone had buzzed non-stop with urgent calls that he had ignored. But now, with a meeting that could decide the fate of his company just moments away, he had no choice but to keep moving. The rain was a nuisance, but it didn't stop him. He barely noticed the figure who had been following him for the past few blocks. She was a woman dressed in ragged clothes, her hair matted from the rain. Her eyes, however, were sharp, focused on Richard as he rushed past the alleyways and through the puddles. She had seen him before, of course, but she wasn't concerned with the suit, the wealth, or the shiny car that had dropped him off. Her life was one of hardship, but she wasn't a stranger to resilience. As Richard hurried through the city's deserted streets, his mind racing, he didn't notice the car that was speeding down the road towards him. The driver was too distracted by his own troubles, swerving to avoid a pothole, his eyes not on the road. The sound of screeching tires was drowned out by the howling wind. In the split second that it took for Richard to realize what was happening, it was already too late. The car veered off course and collided with the curb, sending Richard flying through the air. His body slammed against the cold pavement, his suit torn, and his head struck hard against the ground. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning. As pain coursed through his body, the world went silent, and then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the figure emerged from the shadows. The beggar, whom Richard hadn't noticed until now, rushed toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. She was no longer thinking about her own troubles or the cold that seeped into her bones. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was getting him help. She knelt beside Richard, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. He was alive, but barely. The impact had left him unconscious, his breath shallow. The woman didn't hesitate. She grabbed his wrist, feeling the faint throb of his pulse, and with all the strength she had, she pulled him towards safety. The road was too dangerous, the chances of getting help too slim, but she knew she couldn't leave him there. She heard a car approaching in the distance, and without thinking twice, she waved her arms, desperately hoping the driver would see her. The car slowed down, and she managed to stop it just in time. The driver, a middle-aged man with an annoyed look on his face, rolled down the window. "What do you want?" he grumbled. "I need help," the woman gasped, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's hurt. Badly. Please, help me get him to a hospital." The man looked at her, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. But when he saw the millionaire CEO lying on the ground, his attitude shifted. He grumbled under his breath but agreed to help. Together, they managed to lift Richard into the car and speed off toward the nearest hospital. The woman sat in the back seat, her eyes fixed on Richard's unconscious form. She had saved him. But what would happen next? She couldn't help but wonder if her actions would go unnoticed, or if they would change the course of both of their lives forever. Richard Hale woke up to a bright, sterile light shining directly into his face. His head throbbed painfully, and his body felt heavy, as though each limb was weighed down by an invisible force. The first thing he noticed was the faint hum of medical equipment in the background. Beeping machines, the soft rustle of nurses moving through the room, and the faint scent of antiseptic filled the air. He tried to move, but his body resisted. The pain was too much. His vision swam as his eyes flickered open. For a moment, confusion clouded his thoughts. He tried to recall what had happened, but the events before losing consciousness were nothing but a blur. The street, the car, the crash. It all rushed back to him in fragments. "Mr. Hale," a voice called softly from the side of his bed. He turned his head slowly, wincing in pain, to find a nurse standing beside him. She was holding a clipboard, her face masked in concern. "You're awake," she said, her voice gentle. "You've had quite an accident. You're in the hospital. Do you remember what happened?" Richard's mind raced as he tried to piece it all together. He remembered the car coming toward him, the screeching tires, the impact. But there was something else. A woman. A beggar. He could see her in his mind, her face frantic as she had pulled him away from the danger, but that was impossible. Why would she help him? Why would she risk her life for someone like him? "Where is she?" Richard asked hoarsely, his voice barely a whisper. His throat felt dry, like sandpaper. The nurse frowned slightly, clearly unsure of what he meant. "Who?" "The woman who helped me," Richard managed to say, his frustration mounting. "She saved my life. Where is she?" The nurse's expression softened, but she didn't immediately answer. Instead, she walked to the door and spoke with another nurse, her words too low for Richard to hear. When she returned, she gave him a reassuring smile. "She's not here, Mr. Hale. You were brought in by a man who stopped to help you. The woman? We haven't seen anyone like that. Are you sure?" Richard blinked, trying to make sense of it. He was certain he wasn't imagining it. The woman had been there. She had dragged him to safety. But now, there was no sign of her. Was it possible she had just disappeared? He sank back into the bed, the weight of confusion settling in his chest. He had no idea what to think. For all his wealth, his power, he had never once been in a position where his life had depended on a stranger's mercy. The events had happened so fast, he hadn't had time to fully process them. As the hours passed, Richard's condition stabilized, but the questions lingered. Who was she? Why had she helped him? And where was she now? The mysterious woman, the following. Morning, Richard's doctor came in with updates on his condition. His injuries, while severe, were not life-threatening. A few broken ribs, a concussion, and multiple bruises and cuts. He was going to be fine, but it would take time for him to recover fully. Once the doctor left, Richard felt the overwhelming need to find the woman. There was no logical reason why she would have come to his aid, yet the fact remained: she had saved his life. In the world he lived in, everything was calculated, every outcome predictable. But this was beyond anything he could have anticipated. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to find her. There was something about her, something that went beyond the fact that she had helped him. A nagging feeling at the back of his mind told him that this chance encounter was going to change the course of his life. As he lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling, Richard began to formulate a plan. He needed answers, and to get them, he would have to take a risk. A day in the streets. 3 days later, Richard stood outside the hospital, leaning against his sleek black car, staring at the rain-soaked streets. He was still recovering, but his mind was sharp. There was no way he could ignore the pull to find the woman. He had his assistant, Clara, track down any woman who had been in the area on the night of the accident. After hours of searching, they had found a name: Sophia Roberts. The name wasn't familiar to him, but the address was. She lived in a run-down part of the city, a place Richard had never ventured into before. He instructed his driver to take him there. He couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. It was as though something deep inside him knew that finding her was crucial, even if he didn't know why. The drive was long, and the neighborhood looked nothing like the affluent areas Richard was used to. Graffiti-covered walls, litter scattered. The streets and the buildings seemed to sag under the weight of time. This was a part of the city that Richard had never paid attention to, a world far removed from his own. When they reached the address, Richard was taken aback. The building was a dilapidated apartment complex, the kind of place where people like him would never dream of setting foot. It stood in stark contrast to the shiny glass skyscrapers of his world. He got out of the car and made his way to the front door. It creaked open when he knocked, revealing a woman in her early 30s, dressed in simple clothes, her face tired but determined. Her eyes widened when she saw Richard standing there. "Mr. Hale?" she asked, clearly surprised. "Yes," Richard replied, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I need to speak with Sophia Roberts." The woman hesitated for a moment, her brow furrowing. "I'm Sophia," she finally said, her voice soft but wary. Richard felt his heart race. This was her, the woman who had saved him, the woman who had risked everything to pull him from the edge of death. He had no idea what to say next, but one thing was certain: his life was never going to be the same again. "I need to talk to you," Richard said, his voice serious. "It's important." Sophia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, she stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. The conversation that changed everything. Inside, the apartment was small and sparsely furnished. A single couch, a table, and a few chairs were all that adorned the room. There was a faint smell of cooking food in the air, but it wasn't the kind of luxury Richard was used to. This was a place of survival, of making do with what little you had. Sophia sat across from him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Richard could feel the weight of the moment. He had crossed a line by coming here, a line that separated his world from hers. "I don't know what you're thinking," Sophia began, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "But I didn't do what I did for anything in return. You need to understand that." Richard nodded. "I know. I'm not here to repay you. I need to understand why you helped me." Sophia looked away for a moment, as though gathering her thoughts. You don't get it, do you? I've been where you are. You live your life, surrounded by all these things, wealth, status, power, and you forget what really matters. You forget that we're all human. I did it because you were a person in need. That's all. It wasn't about you being a millionaire or anything. It was about you being a human being. Her words hit Richard harder than he had expected. She wasn't speaking from a place of desperation or wanting anything in return. She was speaking from a place of raw truth, a truth that made Richard realize just how far removed he had become from the reality most people faced every day. He didn't know what to say. He was used to being in control, used to making decisions that shaped the world around him. But right now, he was at a loss for words. This woman, this stranger, had taught him something in a matter of moments that his years of wealth and success had never been able to. After a long silence, Richard finally spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "Then what now?" Sophia met his gaze, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite decipher. "What do you mean?" "Why did you help me?" Richard asked again, this time with more urgency. "You said it wasn't about my money, but there has to be more to it than that." Sophia didn't answer right away. She simply stared at him, as though weighing her next words carefully. When she finally spoke, it was with a quiet intensity. "Because I believe that people like you need to understand something, and I'm the one who can show you." Richard was silent, his mind racing with the possibilities. What did she mean by that? What was she really trying to say? "I'll help you," Sophia said, her tone unwavering. "But only if you're willing to learn." And just like that, Richard's world shifted once again. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness was about to take him down a path he never could have imagined. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, paperwork, and a growing sense of unease. Richard couldn't stop thinking about Sophia and the strange bond that had formed between them in such a short amount of time. The questions that had haunted him in the hospital remained unanswered. Why had she helped him? Why was she so willing to put herself at risk for someone she didn't even know? These thoughts consumed his mind as he returned to his sleek office high in the sky, but the answers eluded him. The transition back to his normal life felt jarring. The office, the meetings, the endless stream of emails and phone calls. It was all still there, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. His interactions with his employees felt superficial. The conversations about profits, deadlines, and projections now felt hollow, like they belonged to someone else. It was as though his old life no longer held the same significance. The crash, the woman who had saved him, it all felt too surreal, too disconnected from the polished world he had built. For the first time, he felt the emptiness of his wealth. Sophia's world. A week after their first meeting, Richard returned to Sophia's apartment. This time the streets seemed more oppressive. The towering buildings that lined the city's skyline no longer seemed like symbols of success. Instead, they felt cold and distant, disconnected from the real world. His world felt separate from hers. One was a place of privilege, and the other was a place of survival. He found Sophia in the same apartment, but she wasn't the same woman he had met that rainy night. There was a certain calmness about her now, a quiet strength that made Richard uneasy. She had not changed her routine since their meeting, continuing with her modest life, surrounded by the same simple furniture and the same set of priorities. When Richard knocked on the door, Sophia greeted him with a smile, but it was tinged with an expression that spoke volumes. She didn't need to ask him why he was there. She had known, even before he had spoken a word. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I've been waiting for you." Richard entered, feeling like an intruder in a world that was not his own. His expensive suit, tailored to perfection, seemed out of place in the small, cluttered apartment. As he sat down on the couch, he noticed how much effort Sophia had put into making the space feel warm. A faded blanket lay across the back of a chair, and a few handmade decorations adorned the walls. This was a world where survival mattered more than appearances. "I wanted to talk to you," Richard began, unsure of where to start. "About what you said the other day, that you could show me something. I don't understand." Sophia raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "You don't have to understand it right now, but I can tell you this. You've been living your life with blinders on. Everything you've achieved has been driven by what society told you mattered. Money, power, status. But none of that is real. It's all just distractions." Richard's mind raced. He had heard these words before, but from people who had no real understanding of what it meant to build something from nothing. Sophia's words, however, resonated differently. There was a truth to them, one he couldn't ignore. He had spent his entire life chasing something he now realized didn't fulfill him. "Then what is real?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "What's real is the connections we make, the lives we touch, the people who matter. Not the buildings, the cars, the endless meetings. Real fulfillment comes from finding purpose, from understanding that life is about more than just surviving. It's about living." Richard swallowed hard, feeling a strange sensation settle in his chest. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and yet something had also been added. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. A responsibility to understand, to change, to become someone who truly lived, not just existed. "Why are you telling me this?" Richard asked, his voice a mix of confusion and desperation. What's in this for you? Sophia smiled softly. Nothing. You're the one who needs to learn this lesson, not me. I've already learned it. I just want to make sure you do, before it's too late. Richard sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The things that had once seemed so important, the deals, the money, the ambition, now felt meaningless in comparison to what Sophia had shared with him. There was no going back now. The first step toward change, as the days turned into weeks, Richard spent more time with Sophia. He visited her apartment regularly, learning about her life, her struggles, and her views on the world. She taught him things he had never even considered. They spoke about the realities of living with nothing, about the tough choices people like Sophia had to make every day just to survive. She had a resilience he couldn't even fathom, and yet she was not hardened. She had a softness, a kindness that made Richard feel both guilty and inspired. Richard, in turn, began to share parts of himself with Sophia that he had never shared with anyone. He talked about his childhood, the pressure he had felt from an early age to succeed, the loneliness that came with being at the top. For all his wealth, Richard realized he had been isolated, surrounded by people, but never really seen. As their conversations deepened, Richard found himself becoming increasingly aware of his own shortcomings. He had lived his life chasing the wrong things, and he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. He had been blind to the world around him, to the people who didn't have the privileges he had been born into. The more time he spent with Sophia, the more he began to understand what she meant. She was not just teaching him about the world, she was teaching him about himself, about the things that truly mattered. An unexpected turn one afternoon, as Richard was leaving Sophia's apartment, his phone rang. It was Clara, his assistant. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice urgent. "You need to come to the office right away. There's something you need to see." Richard felt a jolt of anxiety. "What's going on?" "It's urgent," Clara repeated. "Please just come." He told Sophia that he had to leave, but he promised to return soon. As he drove to the office, his mind raced. Something was off. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. When he arrived, Clara was waiting for him at the door. Her face was pale, and she looked as though she had been through a great deal of stress. "What happened?" Richard asked, his heart pounding. "It's about the company," Clara said. "There's been a massive leak. Someone inside has been selling our trade secrets. Our competitors are using it to undercut us. It's bad, Richard, really bad." Richard felt his blood run cold. The company he had spent years building, his legacy, was at risk. The very foundation of his success was crumbling before his eyes. "You need to find out who did this," Clara continued, "and fast." For the first time in weeks, Richard felt a surge of panic. He had spent so much time focusing on the wrong things, on changing his life, on understanding what truly mattered, that he had let his guard down. Now his empire was on the verge of collapse, but there was something else that tugged at his thoughts: Sophia. She had warned him, she had told him that the things he valued were distractions. Maybe this was the test he had to face. Maybe this was the moment when he would have to choose. Return to his old life, or continue down the path Sophia had shown him. The air in Richard's office felt thicker than it had ever been. Clara had just informed him about the corporate leak, the betrayal from within his own ranks. A chill ran down his spine as he sat at his desk, staring blankly at the reports in front of him. He had spent years building his empire, sacrificing relationships, and focusing solely on growth. The fact that someone within his inner circle, had undermined him with such calculated precision left him reeling. He ran his hands over his face, exhaustion and frustration mounting. The betrayal cut deep. Richard had always surrounded himself with people he trusted, or so he thought. But now, as the severity of the leak settled in, he wondered how much of what he had built was based on true loyalty. How much of his world had been built on false pretenses. As the evening drew in, Richard found himself staring out of the window, watching the city lights flicker below. The skyscrapers that once seemed like symbols of his success now felt like cold, unfeeling giants that stood witness to his growing disillusionment. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sophia. "Are you okay?" Richard smiled faintly at the simplicity of her words. She had no idea what was happening, but somehow she always knew when he needed to hear from her. Her presence, her perspective, was the one thing that had given him any sense of clarity in recent weeks. He typed back, "I'm not sure anymore. A lot has changed." He didn't expect her to respond quickly, but to his surprise, her reply came almost instantly. "Change is inevitable, but you don't have to face it alone." Her words hit harder than he anticipated. It was as if she had peered into his soul and understood the turmoil brewing inside him. He realized that his problems, his struggles, were not simply external. They had become internal battles, conflicts between his old familiar world and the new reality that Sophia had started to show him. The decision to fight back. The following day, Richard threw himself into his work with a renewed focus. The leak needed to be addressed immediately. He summoned his senior team to a meeting, determined to identify the mole and prevent further damage. As they gathered in the sleek conference room, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He had trusted these people, confided in them, and now his empire was at risk. "Clara, gather the data," Richard said, his voice firm. "We need to know exactly who had access to the information that was leaked. I want to know everything, from the smallest detail." Clara nodded, her face tight with worry. "I've already started gathering the information, Richard. But I can't promise it will be easy. Someone on the inside is very good at covering their tracks." Richard nodded grimly. "I don't care how good they are. We will find them." As the meeting continued, Richard found himself distracted. His mind wandered back to Sophia. She had been a constant in his life over the past few weeks. Every time he felt overwhelmed, lost, or unsure, he turned to her. She had become more than just a source of guidance. In many ways, she was the grounding force that kept him tethered to reality. But even her calming presence couldn't shield him from the hard choices that lay ahead. Later that evening, as the weight of the day's work began to settle in, Richard couldn't shake the feeling of suffocation. His world felt too small, too confined. It was as though he had spent years climbing a mountain, only to reach the summit and realize it was the wrong peak. The shadow of the past, Richard's internal conflict, wasn't just about the corporate leak. It was about the choices he had made in the past, the paths he had chosen to take in the name of ambition. It wasn't just about the betrayal of his employees. It was the realization that he had betrayed himself. All his wealth, all his achievements, had been hollow. As Richard sat in his office that evening, the city lights flickering below like distant stars, he was overwhelmed with a sudden urge to leave. The office, the meetings, the endless demands, they all felt like a prison. He needed to escape. Without thinking twice, Richard stood up, grabbed his coat, and left the building. The cold air hit him like a slap in the face, but it was refreshing. He walked aimlessly through the streets, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Minutes turned into hours as he wandered through the city. His mind was in a whirlwind, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't continue living like this. Something had to change. He had to choose between continuing down the path of power and wealth or embracing the uncertain, unknown life that Sophia had introduced him to. He ended up at a small cafe near the outskirts of the city. It was quiet, the soft murmur of conversation, blending with the clinking of coffee cups. As he sat down at a table near the window, Richard pulled out his phone and typed a message to Sophia. "I don't know where to go from here. Everything is falling apart." He waited, staring at the screen, as his mind continued to race. He didn't expect an immediate reply, but within minutes her response came through. "You're already here, Richard. You just don't know it yet." Richard stared at the words, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something in her message that both comforted and confused him. Was she talking about him physically being in the cafe, or was there a deeper meaning? He sat back, closing his eyes, trying to clear his thoughts, but the weight of his decisions hung heavy. Could he really walk away from everything he had built? Could he give up the empire, the success, the life that so many envied, for a chance at something that seemed so uncertain? Suddenly, Richard felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. He stood up abruptly, leaving money on the table, and rushed out of the cafe. He knew what he had to do. The confrontation. Richard arrived at Sophia's apartment just as the sun was setting. The familiar sights of the city, the streets he had walked so many times before, felt different now. Everything seemed to have changed. Sophia was waiting for him when he arrived. She didn't ask him why he was there or what had happened. She simply smiled and stepped aside, letting him into her home. "I've made tea," she said, her voice calm. "Sit down." Richard didn't speak at first. He simply sat at the small table in the kitchen, his mind racing. The conversation that was about to happen wasn't just another exchange of words. It was a turning point, a moment of truth. "Sophia," Richard began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "I don't know what to do anymore. Everything I've built feels hollow. The company, the success, it all feels so empty. But at the same time, I can't walk away from it. I can't just abandon everything I've worked for." Sophia sat down across from him, her eyes soft but understanding. "You don't have to abandon anything, Richard. You just need to find a way to reconnect with what truly matters. You've been chasing something for so long that you've forgotten why you started in the first place." Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration building inside him. "I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to stop chasing something that's been ingrained in me for so long." Sophia's voice was gentle yet firm. "The first step is realizing that you're the one in control. You don't have to keep running. You don't have to keep chasing the same thing." The silence between them was thick with meaning. Richard didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the brink of something real, something that went beyond power, wealth, and success. It was about finding his true self, about reclaiming his life. For the first time, Richard didn't feel the weight of his empire. Instead, he felt the weight of his own choices, and for the first time, he felt the possibility of change. Richard Hale hadn't felt like this in years. Like a man standing at a crossroads, the path ahead shrouded in mist, with no clear way forward. The success, the wealth, the empire he had spent years building. They all seemed distant now, as though they no longer mattered, but they still weighed heavily on his shoulders, as did the realization that walking away from them would be far from easy. Sophia's words echoed in his mind as he sat in the quiet of her apartment. "You don't have to keep running. You don't have to keep chasing the same thing." Her voice, calm and grounded, had given him the clarity he needed, but now that clarity felt more like a burden. How could he simply let go of everything he had built? Could he really abandon the world he knew for a life he had never imagined? The tension in his chest grew with each passing moment. His mind was a battlefield between two sides. The man who wanted to retain control, the one who had spent years fighting for power, and the man who felt a deep desire to change, to break free from the cycle of ambition that had consumed him. The call of the past. Richard sat lost in thought. The sound of his phone ringing broke through the silence. He glanced at the screen. his heart sinking when he saw the name. It was Clara. "Richard," she said urgently, "we've tracked down the source of the leak. It's Ben." Ben, Richard's trusted COO. The man who had been by his side since the early days, the man who had shared his vision and helped build the empire they now had. Richard had never suspected him. Ben was always the calm, collected one. Everything Richard had relied on to stabilize the company. The news hit like a punch to the gut. "I thought you were investigating the data breach," Richard said, his voice cold despite the anger bubbling inside him. "We were," Clara replied. "But it seems Ben has been leaking confidential information for months. He's been in contact with competitors, sharing trade secrets, giving them the advantage." Richard felt the world spinning around him. Betrayal. It wasn't just a business setback, it felt personal. The man who had helped him climb to the top, who had been his closest ally, had been working against him all along. The pain of the betrayal gnawed at him, making his chest tighten in disbelief. "I'll take care of it," Richard muttered, his thoughts racing. "Where is he now?" "He's in the office," Clara replied. "We've locked the doors, but he's refusing to speak to anyone but you." The confrontation. It was the confrontation Richard had never imagined. He drove to the office in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a force that left his knuckles white. Each mile felt like a weight, dragging him down further into the depths of his anger. Ben had been more than just an employee. He had been a friend, a confidant. And now Richard was left with the question of how to deal with someone who had betrayed him in the worst possible way. As Richard entered the boardroom, he was met by Clara, who looked as though she had been waiting for this moment for hours. She gave him a small nod, signaling that Ben was waiting inside. "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" Clara asked, her voice laced with concern. "I need to," Richard replied, his gaze hardening. "I need to hear it from him. I need to know why." The room felt colder than usual. Richard stood at the entrance, his eyes falling on Ben, who sat at the large conference table, his posture rigid. The betrayal was evident in his eyes. He had always been the composed, strategic mind behind their operations, but now Richard saw something different. There was fear in his gaze. "Ben," Richard began, his voice steady but laced with pain. "What the hell happened?" Ben didn't meet Richard's eyes immediately. He stared at the floor for a long moment, as though struggling to find the words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and weary. "I did it because I had to. I'm not proud of it, Richard. But you don't know what it's like, trying to keep up with all this. The pressure, the constant demands, the expectation to never fail. You never saw it, but I was drowning. And when they offered me an out, a chance to finally get away from all this, I took it. I didn't think it would go this far." Richard's heart pounded as Ben spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. He could hear the desperation in Ben's voice, the same desperation he had felt before, when the pressure to succeed had threatened to crush him. But he couldn't allow himself to sympathize with Ben, not now, not after everything that had happened. "You betrayed me," Richard said, his voice sharp. "You betrayed everything we built together. You betrayed me, Ben, and you betrayed everyone in this company." Ben's eyes flicked up to meet Richard's for the first time, and the shame in them was palpable. "I know. I've been trying to find a way to make it right, but I know I can't. I wanted out. I didn't know how else to fix it." Richard stared at him for a long moment. He wanted to feel angry, to lash out at Ben for what he had done, for how much damage he had caused. But instead, all Richard felt was a deep sense of sorrow. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about everything Ben had sacrificed to maintain the facade of success. He had let himself be consumed by the same pressures that had driven Richard to the brink in the past. And now, That pressure had torn them apart. "You're fired, Ben," Richard said quietly. "But I'm not going to make this harder than it needs to be. I'll give you a severance package and you can leave, but I'll never forgive you for this." Ben nodded, his face pale. "I don't expect you to. I'm sorry, Richard." Richard turned and walked out of the room, his heart heavy with the weight of the betrayal. As he exited the building, the realization hit him hard. This was his doing too. He had created an environment that demanded more than anyone could give. He had pushed people like Ben into corners, and now the cost of that had come due. The price of ambition was high, and the toll it took was far greater than he had ever imagined. Turning back as the days passed, Richard found himself in a deep reflection. Ben's betrayal was just the latest in a series of revelations that had changed everything for him. His relationship with Sophia had deepened, and she had become his anchor, the one person who understood the conflict raging inside him. But despite the clarity she had provided, Richard couldn't ignore the reality of his situation. His empire was on the line, and he was torn between the man he was becoming and the man he had always been. Sophia had told him that he didn't need to keep running, but what did that mean for him now? Could he really walk away from everything? Could he step out of the shadows of power and control and into a world where his value wasn't determined by his success? He met Sophia at a park later that evening. It was quiet, peaceful, an oasis in the midst of the chaos of the city. As he sat down beside her, the weight of the last few days seemed to lift just slightly. "I let him down," Richard said softly. "Ben, I pushed him too far. I pushed myself too far." Sophia looked at him, her expression gentle but firm. "No, Richard, you didn't let him down. He made his choices, just as you've made yours. And now you have to choose what kind of man you want to be. It's not too late for you, but you can't keep running from yourself." Richard nodded slowly. Her words resonated deeply with him. He had spent so much time trying to control everything around him that he had never once stopped to ask himself if it was worth it. Now he was faced with the choice of whether he could truly change, or if he would allow himself to be swallowed by the very empire he had built. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was his to walk. The days that followed Richard's confrontation with Ben were some of the hardest he had ever faced. The leak, the betrayal, and the unraveling of the life he had worked so hard to build were all taking their toll. But even more than that, it was the emotional weight of his choices, the pull between his old life and the new one he had begun to shape, that haunted him. He had spent his entire life striving for success, for power, for control. But now, those things seemed meaningless. The empire he had built, the wealth and status that defined him, now felt like chains, holding him prisoner to a past he was no longer sure he wanted. And yet, there was Sophia. She had become his touchstone in all of this. The person who had shown him that there was more to life than just the grind of ambition. She had opened his eyes to the world beyond the boardrooms and the cold, calculating decisions that had once been his life's focus. But even with Sophia's influence, Richard could not shake the nagging doubt that lingered in the back of his mind. What would happen to everything he had built if he walked away? What would happen to his legacy, his company, his future? A final decision. It was early morning when Richard stood in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The sky was still dark, the first rays of sunlight just beginning to creep over the horizon. The world was quiet, but inside him there was a storm raging. He had spent the past few days deliberating about the company, about Ben, and about his own future. The weight of everything he had worked for was pressing down on him, but he knew deep down, that the time had come to make a decision. He couldn't continue living like this, torn between two worlds. Something had to give. "Mr. Hale." Richard turned to see Clara standing in the doorway. She was holding a folder in her hands, but her expression was unreadable. Richard had known Clara for years, and he had always respected her professionalism. But today, her gaze was different, warmer, but tinged with concern. "I need to speak with you," she said softly. Richard gestured for her to come in. As she sat down, he could tell that she was hesitant, unsure of how to approach the conversation. Richard had no idea what was coming, but he could feel the weight of the moment. "Is everything all right?" Richard asked, his voice steady, but his mind still racing. Clara took a deep breath. "No, Mr. Hale, it's not." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've been looking into the financials," Clara began. "And there's something I need to tell you, something that could impact your decision moving forward." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting news about the company's immediate future, about how they would recover from the leak, how they would handle the fallout from Ben's betrayal. But this was something else. "There's been more financial mismanagement than we initially thought," Clara continued. "And it's not just Ben. There's a deeper issue within the company. It's systemic. The leaks, the misappropriation of funds, everything points to a much larger problem than we realized." Richard's mind spun. The empire he had built, the fortress he had spent years constructing, was starting to crack. It was as if everything he had worked for was crumbling before his eyes. But there was something else, a part of him that felt strangely relieved. "Who's responsible?" Richard asked, his voice tight. Clara's eyes darkened. "It's hard to say, but we can't ignore it any longer. The company is on the brink, Richard. If we don't act soon, it will be too late." Richard ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The empire was on the edge of collapse, the betrayals, the leaks, the pressure. It was all coming to a head. But as he stood there looking at Clara, he realized something that hit him harder than any revelation about the company. It wasn't just the company that was broken, it was him. This wasn't just a business problem, it was a personal one. Turning away from the empire. Later that afternoon, Richard found himself back at Sophia's apartment, the place that had become his refuge from the chaos of the outside world. She had become his anchor, the one person who had seen him for who he truly was, not the CEO, not the millionaire, but just a man trying to find his way. She greeted him with a warm smile as he entered, but she could tell immediately that something was wrong. Richard had never been one to hide his emotions, but today he could hardly bring himself to look at her. "I need to talk to you," Richard said quietly. Sophia gestured for him to sit. She could see the weight on his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. "What's going on, Richard?" He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment he had to confront the truth about his life, his future, and the choices he had to make. "I've been living in a lie," Richard said, his voice heavy. "I've been chasing something that I thought would make me happy, but it's only made me miserable. I've built an empire, but it's not mine anymore. It never was." Sophia's gaze softened, and she reached out to take his hand. "What do you mean?" "I've spent my life building this company," Richard continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But it's not just about the company anymore. It's about who I've become, the man I was, the man I thought I had to be. He's not the person I want to be. I can't keep running this place, Sophia. I can't keep living a life." "That doesn't mean anything." Sophia squeezed his hand, her eyes full of understanding. "Then what are you going to do?" Richard's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. "I'm going to walk away. I'm going to let go of this empire, this life that I've been clinging to for so long. I'm going to start over. I don't know what that means yet, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that this is what I want." Sophia's smile was soft, but it was full of pride. "I'm proud of you, Richard. You're finally choosing yourself. A new beginning." Richard's decision was not an easy one. It wasn't just about the company. It was about his entire life, the identity he had spent years constructing. But as he left the office for the final time, he felt a strange sense of freedom. He didn't know where he was going, what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was living for himself. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk. He knew he would have to rebuild, not just his business, but his life, his values, his sense of purpose. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. With Sophia by his side, he felt like he had a chance at a future that was real. As they sat together in the park, watching the sunset, Richard knew that the journey was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, but for the first time he was ready to face them with hope in his heart. The lessons he had learned, the importance of human connection, the need for authenticity, the value of living a life true to oneself, would guide him as he built something new, something meaningful. "I don't know where this road will take us," Richard said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "But I know one thing. It's the road I'm meant to be on." Sophia smiled, squeezing his hand. "And I'll be with you every step of the way." The end.